The crystal chandeliers of the Wellington Hotel ballroom cast fractured light across 300 guests in tailored suits and designer gowns. Grace Mitchell stood near the edge of the room, her champagne glass untouched, watching her husband laugh with a group of executives she had never met. His hand rested casually on the small of another woman's back. Not once in the past 2 hours had he looked in her direction. She smoothed the fabric of her emerald dress, the one she had spent 3 weeks choosing, hoping it would remind him of the woman he had married 4 years ago. But Marcus Mitchell had not complimented her when she descended the stairs of their brownstone in Brooklyn. He had glanced at his watch and muttered something about traffic. The ballroom buzzed with conversations about mergers and acquisitions, stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Grace understood none of it. She was a kindergarten teacher from a small town in Vermont, a woman who had fallen in love with a charming law student she met at a coffee shop near Columbia University. That man had promised her adventures and laughter. He had promised to show her the world. Instead, he had shown her the inside of an empty penthouse apartment where she waited for him night after night, cooking dinners that grew cold on marble countertops. A waiter passed with a tray of appetizers. Grace shook her head politely, her appetite gone. She watched Marcus lean closer to the brunette beside him, his smile wide and genuine in a way it never was when he looked at his wife. The woman laughed, touching his arm, and something inside Grace finally cracked. 4 years. 4 years of cancelled plans and forgotten anniversaries. 4 years of being introduced as an afterthought at company events, if she was introduced at all. 4 years of sleeping beside a stranger who checked his phone more than he checked on her well-being. She set her champagne glass on a passing tray and walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step carrying her further from the life she had tried so desperately to make work. The November air hit her face as she pushed through the hotel doors, sharp and cold and somehow cleansing. The doorman offered to call her a car, but Grace shook her head. She needed to walk, she needed to feel the city around her, the honking taxis and the distant sirens and the crowds of people rushing toward their own complicated lives. Manhattan at night was a universe of strangers, and for the first time in years Grace did not feel alone in her loneliness. She walked 12 blocks before her feet began to ache. The Brooklyn Bridge loomed in the distance, its lights reflecting off the East River like scattered diamonds. Grace found a bench near the waterfront and sat down, pulling her thin coat tighter against the wind. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. A text from Marcus. "Where did you go? The partners are asking about you." She stared at the message for a long moment. Not where are you, not are you okay, but where did you go? As if her only purpose was to be present for the partners, a decorative accessory to his carefully constructed image. Grace typed her response slowly, her fingers trembling from cold and something deeper. "I am done. Do not come home tonight." She pressed send before she could change her mind. The response came almost immediately. "What are you talking about?" "Stop being dramatic." But Grace was already walking again, her phone silenced and buried in her bag. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not go back to that apartment, to that bed, to that life of invisible loneliness. She walked until she found herself outside a small diner in the financial district, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and cracked vinyl booths. A bell chimed as she pushed through the door. The warmth inside wrapped around her like an embrace, carrying the scent of coffee and bacon and something baking in an unseen oven. Grace slid into a booth by the window and ordered coffee. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Dolores, studied her for a moment before disappearing behind the counter. The coffee arrived in a chipped mug, strong and black. Grace wrapped her hands around it, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. Through the window, she watched the city continue its endless motion, indifferent to the small drama of one woman's breaking heart. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough for the coffee to go cold. Long enough for the diner to empty and fill again with a new wave of late-night customers. Long enough for the reality of what she had done to settle into her bones. She had left her husband. After 4 years of trying to be enough, she had finally accepted that she never would be. The realization was both devastating and liberating. A weight lifted, and a void created in the same terrible moment. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was not Marcus. The caller ID showed a name she had not expected. Richard Mitchell, her father-in-law. Grace hesitated before answering. In 4 years of marriage, she had met Richard Mitchell exactly 3 times. He was a tall man with silver hair and eyes the color of winter storms, always impeccably dressed, always watching from the periphery of family gatherings with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Marcus rarely spoke of his father, and when he did, his voice carried a strange mixture of reverence and fear. She pressed the green button. "Hello? Grace?" Richard's voice was deep and measured, each word carefully chosen. "I understand there has been some difficulty this evening." She almost laughed. Difficulty. That was one way to describe the implosion of her marriage. "I am afraid I do not wish to discuss it," she said, with all due respect. A pause stretched across the line. Then, "I am not calling about my son, Grace. I am calling about you." She frowned, confusion cutting through her emotional exhaustion. "About me? Where are you right now?" The question should have felt intrusive, but something in his tone made it sound like concern. Real concern, the kind she had not heard from anyone in the Mitchell family since the day she married into it. "A diner," she said, "near Wall Street. I am not sure of the exact address." "Stay there," Richard said. "I am sending someone to bring you somewhere safe for the night. We have much to discuss, you and I. Things you deserve." "Oh, no." The line went dead before she could respond. Grace stared at her phone, trying to make sense of the conversation. What could Richard Mitchell possibly want to discuss with her? What things did she deserve to know? And why had he sounded almost urgent, as if her safety was a genuine concern? She thought about leaving, about finding her own way to a hotel, or calling one of the few friends she had made in the city. But something held her in that booth, some instinct that whispered this. Phone call was the beginning of something she did not yet understand. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up outside the diner. A man in a dark suit emerged from the driver's side and walked through the door with purposeful strides. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 35, with a shaved head and the build of someone who spent serious time in a gym. His eyes scanned the room before landing on her. "Mrs. Mitchell." His voice was polite but firm. "I am here to take you to Mr. Mitchell." Grace gathered her coat and clutch, leaving a $20 bill on the table for Dolores. As she followed the man to the SUV, she noticed how his jacket bulged slightly at the hip. She had grown up in Vermont, surrounded by hunters. She knew the shape of a concealed weapon. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. The SUV wound through Manhattan's late-night streets, eventually crossing into New Jersey. Grace watched the city skyline shrink in the rearview mirror, replaced by the dark expanse of industrial warehouses and shipping yards. They drove for what felt like an hour before turning onto a private road lined with ancient oak trees. The estate that emerged from the darkness took her breath away. It was a Georgian mansion, 3 stories of red brick and white columns, its windows glowing with warm light. The grounds stretched endlessly in every direction, manicured lawns and formal gardens visible even in the dim illumination of landscape lighting. This was not the suburban house where Marcus had grown up, the modest colonial he had described in their early days of dating. This was something else entirely. This was wealth on a scale Grace had never imagined. The driver opened her door and escorted her up the stone steps. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing Richard Mitchell in a cashmere sweater and pressed trousers, looking nothing like the intimidating figure she remembered from family gatherings. "Grace," he said, stepping aside to let her enter, "thank you for coming." The foyer was all marble and mahogany, dominated by a sweeping staircase and a crystal chandelier that dwarfed the ones at the hotel ballroom. Oil paintings lined the walls, portraits of stern-faced men in antiquated clothing, their eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. Richard led her to a study at the back of the house, a room lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive fireplace. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs and antique furniture. He gestured to a pair of armchairs facing the flames. "Please, sit. You must be exhausted." Grace lowered herself into the chair, her mind racing with questions. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your hospitality, but I really do not understand why I am here." Richard settled into the chair across from her, his storm-grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "You are here because my son is a fool," he said simply. "And because you deserve to understand the truth about the family you married into before you decide your next steps." The truth. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Grace, what do you know about the Mitchell family business?" She thought about what Marcus had told her over the years. "Import and export," she said, "international shipping and logistics." A ghost of a smile crossed Richard's face. "That is not untrue," he said, "but it is also not the whole truth." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "My family has been in this country for 4 generations, Grace. We came from Sicily with nothing but determination and a willingness to do what others would not." Grace felt her chest tighten. She understood what he was implying, even if her mind resisted the conclusion. "You are saying, I am saying that the Mitchell empire is built on foundations that most people prefer not to acknowledge." Richard's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "We operate in the spaces between legal and illegal, between what society permits and what it pretends does not exist. We have survived for over a century by being smarter, more disciplined, and more ruthless than our competitors." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Grace stared at the man across from her, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew. Her husband, the corporate lawyer with the expensive suits and the corner office, was the son of a crime boss. Her father-in-law, the distant figure who appeared at Christmas and disappeared before dessert, controlled an empire built on shadows. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked. "Because you are leaving my son," Richard said, "and because I believe you deserve to know what you are leaving and what you may still be connected to, whether you wish it or not." Grace's blood ran cold. "Are you threatening me?" Richard shook his head slowly. "No, Grace. I am warning you. There are people in my world who do not distinguish between family and former family, people who might see your departure as a loose thread to be cut." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her want to look away but could not. "I am telling you this because I want to protect you. Because in 4 years of watching you try to love my undeserving son, I have come to respect your kindness, your patience, and your strength." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, though she could not say whether they were from fear or exhaustion or the strange, unexpected warmth in his words. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Tomorrow we will talk more," he said finally. "Tonight you will rest. There is a guest suite prepared for you on the 2nd floor. In the morning, once you have had time to process what I have told you, I will explain what I am offering." He stood, offering her his hand. "I know this is overwhelming, but I promise you, Grace, I mean you no harm. I only want to give you the protection and the choices my son failed to provide." Grace accepted his hand and rose to her feet. Her legs felt unsteady, her mind a storm of confusion and fear, and something else she could not name. She followed a housekeeper up the grand staircase to a suite that was larger than her entire apartment in Brooklyn. That night, lying in a 4-poster bed beneath silk sheets, Grace stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of her life. 12 hours ago, she had been preparing for a company dinner, hoping her husband might notice her new dress. Now she was in the mansion of a man who had just admitted to running a criminal organization, and somehow, impossibly, she felt safer here than she had felt in her own home in years. Sleep found her eventually, pulling her down into dreams of chandeliers and gunshots, and a pair of storm-grey eyes that promised protection in a world she no longer understood. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you enjoy stories that reveal the hidden strength within ordinary women facing extraordinary circumstances, this is the place for you. Subscribe now and join us for more tales of courage, transformation, and the power of choosing your own destiny. Morning light filtered through heavy curtains, casting golden stripes across the guest suite. Grace woke slowly, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, before the memories of the previous night crashed back into her consciousness. The dinner, the text, the diner, Richard Mitchell and his impossible revelations. She sat up in bed, her mind clearer than it had been in months. Whatever happened next, she could not go back to the life she had been living. That much was certain. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A moment later, a young woman in a crisp uniform entered with a breakfast tray. Fresh fruit, eggs, toast, and coffee, the aroma filling the room with warmth. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell would like to see you in the garden. Room whenever you are ready. There is no rush." Grace showered and dressed in the clothes that had been laid out for her, simple but elegant pieces that fit perfectly. She wondered how Richard had known her size, then decided she probably did not want the answer. The garden room was a glass-enclosed space at the back of the mansion, overlooking a formal garden that stretched toward a distant tree line. Richard sat at a wrought-iron table, a newspaper folded beside his untouched coffee. He rose when she entered, pulling out a chair for her. "You look rested," he observed. "I am glad." Grace sat down, accepting the coffee a server poured for her. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your hospitality, but I need to understand what is happening here." Richard nodded, folding his hands on the table. Direct. "I have always admired that about you, Grace." "Very well. Let me be equally direct." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My son is a disappointment," he said finally. "Not because he chose law instead of the family business. I respect his desire to forge his own path, but because he chose to treat his marriage as an inconvenience rather than a commitment, because he chose to ignore a woman of genuine worth in favor of empty ambition." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. She was not accustomed to hearing anyone speak of her this way. "I have watched you for 4 years," Richard continued, "at family gatherings, at the few dinners you attended with Marcus, in the way you carry yourself despite being consistently overlooked. You have a strength that my son failed to recognize, a loyalty he failed to appreciate." He leaned forward, his storm-gray eyes intense. "I am offering you a choice, Grace. You can leave today with enough money to start over anywhere you wish. I will ensure your safety and provide resources to build a new life far from anything connected to the Mitchell name." Grace felt her heart racing. "And the other option?" "The other option," Richard said slowly, "is that you stay. Not as my daughter-in-law, but as a member of my household. You would have protection, resources, and a purpose beyond the empty existence my son provided." Grace set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. "What kind of purpose?" Richard stood and walked to the windows overlooking the garden. "I have dedicated my life to building an empire," he said, "but I have failed in other ways. My wife passed away 15 years ago. My son has proven himself unworthy of the values I tried to instill. I am surrounded by loyalty bought with money and fear, but genuine care is a rare commodity in my world." He turned to face her. "I am not asking you to become a criminal, Grace. I would never insult you that way. But I'm asking if you might consider becoming something this household desperately needs, a civilizing presence, a moral compass, someone who can remind me and those around me that there is more to life than power and control." Grace stared at him, trying to understand what he was proposing. "You want me to stay here? In your house?" "In my family," Richard corrected gently. "Not as a prisoner or an obligation, but as a genuine member. You would have your own quarters, your own finances, complete freedom to pursue whatever life you choose. I ask only that you bring your presence, your kindness, to a household that has been without both for too long." It was the strangest proposal Grace had ever received. A man she barely knew was offering her a place in a world she had only just learned existed, a world of shadows and power that should have terrified her. And yet, sitting in this sun-filled room with the scent of roses drifting through open windows, she felt an odd sense of possibility. "I need time to think," she said. Richard nodded, unsurprised. "Of course, take all the time you need. You are welcome to stay here while you consider, or I can arrange accommodations elsewhere if you prefer." He paused, something softening in his expression. "But Grace, whatever you decide, know that my offer of protection stands. You are no longer just my son's wife. You are someone I have come to respect in your own right." Grace spent the next 3 days at the estate, wandering its gardens and libraries, processing everything that had happened. She learned that the household staff treated Richard with a mixture of respect and genuine affection, that he hosted a monthly dinner for local charities, that he read poetry in the evenings by the fire. She also learned that the grounds were patrolled by armed guards, that visitors were screened through multiple security checkpoints, and that certain wings of the house were off limits, their doors always closed. It was a world of contradictions, beauty and danger, kindness and control. And somehow impossibly Grace found herself drawn to it. On the 4th day, she received a package from Marcus, divorce papers already signed, with a check for what he considered her fair share of their assets. The amount was insulting, a fraction of what she knew their joint holdings were worth. Attached was a note in his familiar handwriting: "Sign and move on." We both know this was a mistake from the beginning. Grace stood in the garden room, the papers trembling in her hands. 4 years of her life reduced to a check and a dismissive note. 4 years of trying, of hoping, of believing that love could be enough. She found Richard in his study, staring at a portrait of a woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. His wife. She realized. The woman who had passed away 15 years ago. He turned at her approach, his expression softening when he saw the papers in her hands. "I have made my decision," Grace said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I will stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I believe you are telling the truth, about wanting something different, about needing someone to remind you of the good in this world." Richard studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, a ghost of a smile, crossing his face. "Welcome to the family, Grace, the real family." Over the following weeks, Grace settled into her new life with a mixture of trepidation and growing confidence. Richard assigned her a comfortable suite in the East Wing with views of the formal gardens and access to a private library. He introduced her to the household staff as a valued member of the family, and their attitude toward her shifted from cautious curiosity to genuine warmth. She learned the rhythms of the estate. Breakfast was served at 7, always with fresh flowers from the greenhouse. Richard took his coffee in the garden room, reading reports that arrived in sealed envelopes. Dinners were formal affairs, held in a mahogany-paneled room with crystal chandeliers and silver service. She also learned the unspoken rules: never ask about the men who came and went at odd hours, never enter the West Wing without invitation, never mention the name of a certain federal agency that seemed to cast a shadow over every conversation. But within those boundaries, Grace found an unexpected freedom. Richard encouraged her to explore the grounds, to visit the nearby town, to continue the teaching work she loved through volunteer programs he arranged. He spoke to her with respect, listened to her opinions, and slowly began to share pieces of his own story. He told her about his childhood in Sicily, the poverty that had driven his grandfather to seek a new life in America. He told her about his father, a man who had built an empire through equal parts brilliance and brutality. He told her about his wife, Maria, the only woman who had ever seen past his position to the person beneath. Grace listened, and gradually she began to understand. Richard Mitchell was not the villain of a crime drama. He was a man caught between legacies, trying to balance the demands of a world he had inherited with the person he wished he could be. One evening, as they sat by the fire in his study, Richard surprised her with a question. "If you could change one thing about your life, Grace, what would it be?" She considered the question carefully. "I would have trusted myself sooner," she said finally. "I spent 4 years trying to be what Marcus wanted, never asking what I wanted. I would have listened to my own instincts instead of silencing them." Richard nodded slowly. "That is wisdom, hard-earned," he said. "Most people never reach it." He was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "I would have protected my wife better," he said finally. "I would have seen the signs of her illness earlier. I would have spent less time building an empire and more time being present for the family I already had." Grace felt her heart ache for the pain in his voice. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him, this powerful man who controlled an empire of shadows, grieving a loss that time had not diminished. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "Some things cannot be changed," she said softly. "But we can. Choose how we move forward." Richard looked at her hand on his, then at her face. His expression shifted, something warm and almost wondering entering his storm-grey eyes. "You are a remarkable woman, Grace. My son was a fool to let you go." From that moment, something changed between them. Not romance, not yet, but a deepening connection that surprised them both. Grace found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the moments when Richard's guard dropped, and she glimpsed the man, beneath the position. But even as this fragile bond grew, shadows gathered on the horizon. Grace did not yet know that her presence in Richard's life had drawn attention from enemies who saw her as a weakness to be exploited. She did not know that Marcus, humiliated by her rejection and suspicious of her sudden disappearance, was asking questions that would lead him down dangerous paths. The storm was coming, and Grace was only beginning to understand the world she had entered. 3 months. After Grace arrived at the estate, spring began to warm the New Jersey countryside. Daffodils pushed through the last traces of snow, and the gardens filled with the songs of returning birds. Grace had settled into a routine that felt almost normal, if one could call anything about this life normal. She had taken over the coordination of Richard's charitable work, organizing fundraisers and volunteer programs that allowed her to use her skills as an educator. The local community had embraced her as someone genuine, a sharp contrast to the polished executives and society wives who typically represented wealthy families in the region. Richard watched her work with an expression she could not quite read. Pride, perhaps, or something deeper, something that made her heart race when their eyes met across the dinner table. One afternoon, Grace was reviewing proposals in the garden room when Richard appeared in the doorway. He was dressed more casually than usual, in jeans and a sweater that softened his typically imposing presence. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. "There is something I want to show you." They strolled through the formal gardens, past the rose arbors and the reflecting pool, until they reached a gate Grace had never noticed before. Richard produced a key and led her through into a wilder section of the grounds where nature had been allowed to grow unchecked. "This was Maria's favorite place," he said quietly. "She called it her secret garden. After she passed, I could not bear to come here. But lately," he paused, looking at Grace with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Lately, I have been thinking that she would have wanted it to live again." They walked in silence through overgrown paths, past dormant flower beds and a small stone fountain choked with leaves. At the center of the garden stood a wrought-iron bench beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches just beginning to bud with new growth. Richard sat down, and after a moment, Grace joined him. The bench was small, their shoulders nearly touching. "I have been thinking about what you said," he told her, "about moving forward, about choosing how we live with the things we cannot change." Grace felt her heart pounding, though she could not have said why. "And what have you concluded?" Richard turned to face her, his storm-grey eyes searching her face. "That I have spent 15 years hiding from life," he said. "Building walls, maintaining control, protecting myself from anything that might cause me to feel again." He reached out almost hesitantly and took her hand. "Until you came." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "Richard, I am not sure what you are saying." "I am saying that you have changed something in me, Grace." He squeezed her hand gently. "I am saying that for the first time in 15 years, I am not afraid to care about someone, to let someone see who I really am." The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility. Grace knew she should be cautious, should remember who this man was and the world he controlled. But sitting in Maria's secret garden, with spring awakening around them and Richard's hand warm in hers, Caution seemed very far away. "I am not afraid either," she said softly. Richard lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. "Then we will figure this out together," he said, "whatever comes. If you have been touched by Grace's journey so far, by her courage to leave behind what no longer served her and open her heart to new possibilities, take a moment to leave a comment below. Write simply, "Sometimes the greatest strength is choosing to begin again." Let us see how many of us believe in second chances. But their fragile peace was about to be tested. That evening, as Grace dressed for dinner, a commotion erupted in the main hall. She heard raised voices, the slam of doors, and something that sounded like furniture being overturned. She hurried downstairs to find Richard standing in the foyer, his expression thunderous. Before him stood Marcus, disheveled and clearly intoxicated, shouting accusations that echoed off the marble walls. "You think I don't know what's going on?" Marcus slurred, pointing at Grace on the stairs. "You think I'm blind? My own father with my wife?" "Former wife," Richard said coldly. "You signed the papers yourself." Marcus laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "This is why, isn't it? You wanted her all along. All those family dinners, all those questions about our marriage. You were just waiting for me to fail so you could swoop in." "You failed all on your own," Richard said. "I simply offered her what you refused to provide: respect, protection, purpose." Grace descended the remaining stairs, her legs unsteady. "Marcus, please," she said. "This is not what you think." He turned to her, his eyes red-rimmed and full of something that might have been pain, might have been rage. "I loved you, Grace. In my own way, I loved you." The words hung in the air, too little and far too late. Grace felt no satisfaction in hearing them, only a weary sadness for the man her husband had become. "Then you should have shown it," she said quietly. "You should have shown it every day, instead of making me feel invisible." Marcus's face contorted, and for a moment she thought he might strike her. But before he could move, two of Richard's guards appeared at his elbows, holding him firmly. "Remove him from the property," Richard ordered, "and make sure he understands that he is not welcome here again." As Marcus was led away, still shouting threats and accusations, Grace felt Richard's hand on her shoulder. His touch was gentle, but there was steel beneath it. "I am sorry you had to see that," he said. She shook her head. It was bound to happen eventually. He was never going to accept the divorce quietly. Richard's expression darkened. "There is more to it than wounded pride," he said. "I have received reports that Marcus has been asking questions, talking to people he should not be talking to, trying to dig up information about the family business." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of people? The kind who would love nothing more than to bring down the Mitchell empire. Richard's voice was grim. Federal prosecutors, investigative journalists, rivals who have been waiting decades for an opening. He turned to face her fully, his hands on her shoulders. "Grace, I need you to understand something. Marcus is no longer simply a nuisance. He is a threat. To this family, to our business, and potentially to you. To me. Why would anyone target me?" "Because of your connection to me," Richard said, "and because Marcus, in his anger and desperation, may not care who gets hurt as long as he feels he has won." Grace absorbed this information, fear and determination warring within her. "What do we do?" Richard's expression softened slightly. "For now, we stay vigilant. I am increasing security, limiting public appearances, and tracking Marcus's movements." He cupped her, face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "And I'm going to keep you safe, Grace, whatever it takes." She believed him. In that moment, looking into his storm-gray eyes, she believed him completely. But the coming weeks would test that belief in ways neither of them could have imagined. Summer arrived with a heat wave that shimmered over the New Jersey countryside. The estate's gardens bloomed in riotous color, but a tension hung over the household that even the sunshine could not dispel. Grace noticed it in the way guards patrolled with increased frequency, in the hushed conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room, in the worried glances Richard thought she did not see. She had learned enough about Richard's world to understand that something was happening, something beyond Marcus's clumsy attempts at revenge. There were late-night meetings in the study, visitors who arrived with briefcases and left with grim expressions, phone calls that Richard took in, private with his jaw set tight. One evening she found him in Maria's garden, sitting on the wrought-iron bench where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed. He looked older than she had ever seen him, the weight of his empire pressing down visibly. "Tell me," she said simply, sitting beside him. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion. "There is a rival organization," he said. "The Corsetti family. We have coexisted for decades, each respecting the other's territory, but their new leader, Vincent Corsetti, is young and ambitious. He wants to expand into areas we have controlled for generations." Grace felt fear curl in her stomach. "What does that mean?" "It means conflict," Richard said. "Possibly prolonged, possibly violent." He turned to look at her, and she saw the worry in his eyes. "It means that keeping you safe has become significantly more difficult." She reached for his hand. "I am not leaving, Richard." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I know. I would not ask you to. But I need you to understand the risks. Vincent Corsetti does not follow the old rules of our world. He does not respect boundaries or innocent parties. If he sees you as a way to hurt me—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Grace thought about the life she had led before, the years of invisibility in Marcus's world. She thought about the woman she had been, willing to shrink herself to fit someone else's expectations. That woman would have run from this danger, but she was not that woman anymore. "Then we face it together," she said. "Whatever comes." Richard lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Together," he agreed. The first sign of trouble came a week later. Grace was returning from a volunteer session at a local school when she noticed a black car following her vehicle. Her driver, a man named Thomas, who had been with Richard for 20 years, noticed it too. "Hold on, Mrs. Grace," he said, his voice calm but tense. "We're taking a detour." What followed was a terrifying 15 minutes of sharp turns and increasing speed, Thomas navigating back roads with expert precision while the black car stayed stubbornly in pursuit. Grace gripped the door handle, her heart pounding, watching the rearview mirror with growing dread. Finally, they reached the estate's security perimeter. Guards emerged from hidden positions, blocking the road. The black car stopped, hesitated, then reversed rapidly and disappeared. Thomas exhaled slowly. "That was too close," he muttered. "We need to report this to Mr. Mitchell immediately." Richard's reaction was swift and decisive. He tripled the security detail, installed additional surveillance throughout the estate, and forbade Grace from leaving the grounds without armed escorts. For 3 days, she did not leave the mansion at all, feeling like a prisoner in a gilded cage. But on the 4th day, Richard came to her with a different expression. Something had changed. "We have intelligence," he said, sitting across from her in the garden room. "Vincent Corsetti is planning something significant, a move against one of our key operations." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I have to respond, Grace. If I don't, it will be seen as weakness, and weakness in my world invites destruction." Grace felt the weight of what he was not saying. "You're going somewhere," she said. "Somewhere dangerous." Richard nodded. "Slowly. There is a meeting arranged. Neutral ground, a chance to resolve this through negotiation rather than confrontation. But if negotiation fails—" He did not finish. Grace stood and crossed to where he sat, taking his hands in hers. "Then come back to me," she said fiercely. "Whatever happens, you come back." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, in an embrace that felt like both promise and farewell. "I will," he said against her hair. "I swear it." The night Richard left for the Meeting was the longest of Grace's life. She sat in the garden room, watching the sun set and the stars emerge, unable to eat or sleep or think about anything but the man who had become her reason for staying. Hours passed. The house grew quiet around her, the staff moving on silent feet, the guards changing shifts with whispered efficiency. Grace remained at the window, watching the driveway for headlights that did not come. It was nearly dawn when she heard the sound of tires on gravel. She was at the front door before the car fully stopped, watching as Thomas emerged from the driver's seat and rushed to open the rear door. Richard stepped out. There was weariness in every line of his body, and his suit was disheveled, his tie loosened. But he was whole. He was alive. Grace flew down the steps and into his arms, not caring who saw or what they thought. She buried her face in his chest, feeling his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and strong and real. "It's done," he murmured, against her hair. "Vincent Corsetti has agreed to respect the traditional boundaries. There will be peace." "How?" she asked, pulling back to look at his face. A ghost of a smile crossed his features. "I made him an offer he couldn't refuse," he said, "something his ambition valued more than conflict with us." He cupped her face in his hands. "I told you I would come back, Grace. I always keep my promises." In the days that followed, the household slowly returned to normal. The extra guards were reassigned, the constant surveillance eased, and Grace was once again able to move freely beyond the estate's grounds. But something had shifted between her and Richard, a deepening of connection that came from surviving crisis together. They spent long evenings in the garden room, talking about everything and nothing. Richard shared more of his history, the choices he had made, and the regrets he carried. Grace told him about her childhood in Vermont, her dreams of making a difference in children's lives, the way her marriage to Marcus had slowly eroded her sense of self. One night, as they sat together watching a summer storm roll across the distant hills, Richard took her hand in his. "Grace," he said, his voice serious in a way that made her heart race. "These past months you have given me something I thought I had lost forever. Hope. Purpose. The belief that I can be more than the role I was born into." She turned to face him, seeing the vulnerability in his storm-grey eyes. "Richard, I feel the same way. You saw me when no one else did. You gave me a place where I could become who I was always meant to be." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Grace felt her breath catch as he opened it, revealing a ring of elegant simplicity, a single diamond set in antique platinum. "I know this world I've brought you into is complicated," he said, "dangerous sometimes, full of shadows and moral ambiguity. But I also know that with you beside me, I am a better man." He paused, gathering courage. "Will you marry me, Grace? Will you make this family real?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, unable to find words. Richard slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "Yes," she finally whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." He pulled her close, and the storm broke over the estate, rain streaming down the windows as they held each other in the garden room. For Grace, it felt like a new beginning, a cleansing of everything that had come before. But even as they celebrated their engagement, another storm was gathering. Marcus Mitchell had not given up his quest for revenge, and he had finally found allies willing to help him achieve it. Autumn painted the New Jersey countryside in shades of amber and gold. Grace and Richard had set a wedding date for late November, and the household buzzed with preparations. The ceremony would be small, intimate, held in Maria's garden with only family and close associates in attendance. Grace wanted nothing like her first wedding, no grand spectacle, no hundreds of strangers, just the people who mattered, gathered to witness a love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. But 3 weeks before the wedding, everything changed. Grace was in the library reviewing final seating arrangements with the estate's event coordinator when raised voices erupted from the foyer. She hurried out to find Richard confronting a man she recognized as one of his senior advisors, a silver-haired gentleman named Salvatore, who had been with the family for decades. "How long?" Richard demanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. Salvatore's face was ashen. Years, he admitted. Almost since the beginning of the investigation, they offered protection for my family. I had no choice. There is always a choice, Richard said coldly, and you chose betrayal. Grace felt the blood drain from her face as she understood what was happening. Salvatore had been an informant, feeding information to whoever was investigating the Mitchell organization. The rival families, the federal agencies, perhaps even Marcus himself. Richard turned to his guards. "Escort Mr. Salvatore to the East Wing," he ordered. "We have much to discuss about the nature of his cooperation." As Salvatore was led away, Richard's eyes found Grace across the foyer. His expression shifted from rage to something softer, more protective. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. "There are things you need to know." In his study, with the doors closed and guards posted outside, Richard explained the situation. Salvatore's betrayal had exposed critical vulnerabilities in the organization. Information had been passed to federal prosecutors, information that could potentially lead to criminal charges against Richard and several of his key associates. "How serious is it?" Grace asked, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Serious enough that I may need to make some difficult decisions," he said finally. "Decisions about the future of this organization, about my own role in it." Grace reached for his hand. "Whatever those decisions are, I support you. Even if it means walking away from everything I've built." Richard's voice was heavy with emotion. "Even if it means starting over, somewhere else, as someone else." She met his eyes without flinching. "I did not fall in love with your empire, Richard. I fell in love with you. The man who reads poetry by the fire. The man who rebuilt a garden for a wife he still mourns. The man who saw me when no one else did." Richard pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I do not deserve you," he murmured. "Yes, you do," she said fiercely. "You deserve to be happy, Richard. You deserve to be loved." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Richard brought in lawyers, negotiated with federal prosecutors, and began the complex process of transitioning his organization toward legitimate operations. It was not a quick process nor an easy one, but for the first time in decades, he was actively choosing to change the legacy he would leave behind. The wedding, despite everything, went forward as planned. On a crisp November afternoon, Grace walked down an aisle of fallen leaves in Maria's garden, wearing a simple ivory gown and carrying a bouquet of roses from the estate's greenhouse. Richard waited beneath the ancient oak tree, his eyes bright with unshed tears as she approached. The ceremony was brief and beautiful, their vows spoken in voices that trembled with emotion. When they kissed for the first time as husband and wife, the assembled guests broke into applause, and Grace felt as though her heart might burst with joy. But the celebration was cut short by an unwelcome arrival. Marcus Mitchell appeared at the garden gate, flanked by 2 federal agents. He was smiling, but it was a smile without warmth, the expression of a man who believed he had finally won. "Congratulations," he called out, his voice dripping with false cheer. "I hope you don't mind if I interrupt your special day with some news." Richard stepped in front of Grace, his body tense. "Whatever you have to say it, and leave." Marcus's smile widened. "The federal prosecutor has accepted my testimony. In exchange for everything I know about the Mitchell organization, and I know plenty from years of family dinners and overheard conversations, I've been granted full immunity." His eyes found Grace behind Richard's protective stance. "And you, dear ex-wife, will have a front-row seat to watch your new husband's empire crumble." The garden fell silent. Grace felt the eyes of every guest upon them, felt the tension crackling like electricity before a storm. But Richard surprised everyone. Instead of fury, he smiled, a calm, almost pitying expression that made Marcus's confidence waver. "I wondered when you would show your hand," Richard said quietly. "I've been expecting this for some time." He glanced at the federal agents. "Gentlemen, I believe you'll find that my cooperation with your investigation has been quite thorough. Everything Mr. Mitchell claims to know is information I've already disclosed voluntarily." Marcus's face went pale. "What are you talking about? Did you really think I wouldn't notice your clumsy attempts at gathering intelligence? Richard asked. Did you really think Salvatore was the only source of information in this household? He shook his head slowly. I've been 3 steps ahead of you for months, Marcus. Every conversation you had with prosecutors, every piece of information you offered was anticipated and neutralized. One of the agents stepped forward, his expression uncomfortable. Mr. Richard Mitchell has been a cooperative witness in our investigation, he confirmed. His testimony has been instrumental in our efforts to prosecute the Corsetti organization and several corrupt officials. He paused. Your information? Mr. Marcus Mitchell was largely redundant. Marcus's face contorted with rage. This isn't over, he snarled. You think you've won, but I will find a way to destroy you. Both of you. No, Richard said, his voice carrying a finality that made Grace's heart swell with pride. This is exactly over. You have nothing left to threaten us with, Marcus. No leverage, no information, no purpose. He gestured to the guards. Please escort my former son-in-law from the property, and this time, make sure he understands that any further contact will be treated as harassment. As Marcus was led away, still shouting threats that grew fainter with distance, Richard turned back to Grace. His expression softened as he saw her standing there, her wedding bouquet crushed, forgotten in her grip. I'm sorry, he said quietly. This was supposed to be our day. But Grace was smiling through her tears. It still is, she said. It's the day we officially became a family. And nothing, not Marcus, not federal, investigations, not any of it, can take that away. Richard pulled her close, and around them the guests slowly began to applaud again. The music resumed, the champagne was poured, and the reception continued as though nothing had happened. Because in the end, nothing important had changed. They were still husband and wife. They were still building a life together, and they were still choosing each other every day against all odds. That night, as they danced alone in the garden room while the last guests departed, Grace rested her head on Richard's shoulder and felt something she had not felt in years. Peace. Complete, unshakable peace. I love you, she murmured against his chest. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I love you too, Grace. More than I ever thought I could love anyone again. The moon rose over the estate, bathing Maria's garden in silver light, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the darkness. Grace closed her eyes and let the music carry her, safe, in the arms of the man who had shown her what it meant to be truly seen. 5 years had passed since that November wedding in Maria's garden. The estate that had once felt like a gilded cage now felt like home, its marble halls warmed by laughter and the patter of small feet. Grace stood at the window of the garden room, watching her daughter chase butterflies through the rose arbor. Isabella was 4 years old now, with her mother's kind eyes and her father's storm-grey determination. She had been born on a spring morning, just as the first daffodils pushed through the last traces of snow, and from her first cry, she had changed everything. Richard appeared at Grace's side, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He handed one to her and followed her gaze to their daughter. She looks so much like you, he said softly. Grace smiled. She has your stubbornness. I prefer to call it persistence. Richard's eyes crinkled with amusement. It's a family trait. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Isabella discover a ladybug on a rose petal. The child's shriek of delight carried across the garden, pure and unself-conscious in a way that never failed to move Grace. So much had changed in 5 years. Richard had completed the transition of his organization to legitimate business operations, a process that had taken years of careful navigation but had ultimately succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The Mitchell name now appeared on hospitals and community centers rather than court, dockets and newspaper scandals. Marcus had eventually found his own peace, remarrying and relocating to California. They exchanged civil holiday greetings now, the sharp edges of their history worn smooth by time and distance. Grace bore him no ill will. He had been part of the journey that led her here, to this window, to this man, to this life she could never have imagined. Your mother would have loved her, Grace said quietly, her eyes still on Isabella. Richard's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. Yes, he agreed, she would have. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "She would have loved you too, Grace, for bringing light back into this house, for teaching me how to feel again." Grace turned to face him, this man who had started as her father-in-law and become her whole world. The years had softened some of his edges, added silver to his temples and laugh lines around his eyes. But the core of him remained, that storm-grey intensity that still made her breath catch when he looked at her. "I never thanked you," she said, "for that phone call. The night I left Marcus, if you hadn't reached out, then we would both have missed something extraordinary," Richard finished. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones in the gesture she had come to love. "I thank the heavens every day that you were brave enough to stay." Isabella came running through the garden room doors, her small hands full of dandelions. "Mommy, Daddy, look what I found." Grace knelt to admire her daughter's treasures, exclaiming over each wilting flower as though it were the most precious gift in the world. Because in a way, it was. Every moment of this life was precious, every ordinary day a miracle she had never expected to receive. Later that evening, after Isabella was tucked into bed and the house had settled into peaceful quiet, Grace found Richard in his study. He was reading by the fire, a book of poetry open in his lap. The same book she knew, that Maria had, given him decades ago. She sat beside him, curling into the warmth of his side. Richard set aside his book and wrapped an arm around her. "Happy?" he asked. Grace considered the question carefully, as she always did. She thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago, standing outside a Manhattan hotel in November cold, her marriage in ruins and her future uncertain. That woman had been broken, invisible, convinced she had nothing left to offer the world. But that woman had also been brave, enough to answer a phone call from a stranger, brave enough to stay when running would have been easier, brave enough to love again when love had hurt her so deeply before. "Yes," she said finally. "Happier than I ever knew I could be." Richard pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then I have done something right with my life." They sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly, the old house settling around them with familiar creaks and sighs. Through the window, the November moon rose, over the gardens, illuminating the paths where Isabella would run tomorrow, and the bench in Maria's garden where Grace and Richard had first acknowledged their love. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked quietly. "Any of it?" Richard was thoughtful for a long moment. "I regret the years I spent hiding from life," he said finally. "The years after Maria when I thought I had no heart left to give." He turned to look at her, his storm-grey eyes soft with emotion. "But everything that came before led me to you, Grace. Every choice, every loss, every moment of darkness. And I would not change the path if it meant losing the destination." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of joy, of gratitude, of profound and overwhelming love. She pressed closer to him, feeling his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and strong and endlessly reassuring. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For seeing me, for choosing me, for building this life with me." Richard tilted her chin up and kissed her, softly, a kiss that held 5 years of shared history and a lifetime of promises still to keep. "Thank you for saving me, Grace," he murmured against her lips. "I was lost in my own empire, surrounded by power and control, but desperately alone. You showed me what it meant to truly live again." The fire crackled, the moon rose higher. And in a study lined with leather-bound books and filled with memories of love lost and love found, 2 people who had found each other against all odds held on to what they had built together. Grace thought about the title of her story, if her life were a story told on a video meant to inspire others. Ignored at her husband's company dinner, Grace ends the marriage, unaware her father-in-law runs the Mafia. It was true, every word of it, but it was also only the beginning. Because the real story, the one that mattered, was about what came after. The courage to stay when running would be easier. The willingness to love again when love had hurt before. The Discovery that home is not a place but a person, and that family is not defined by blood but by choice. Grace had chosen, and in choosing she had found everything she never knew she was looking for. If you have watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I have watched this far." This way I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Also, if this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel to join our community of dreamers who believe in second chances and the transformative power of love. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Until the next story. The end.